Welcome to Ideas in Action, the official University of Southern California podcast. This show was recorded live on USC's campus.
Okay, so I am Juan de Lara. I'm an associate professor here at USC in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity. I'm also the director of the Latinx and Latin American Studies Center, which until 3 years ago did not exist. I know it's shocking at a place like USC and in a city like LA, but it's true. A lot of the work that we are doing has been especially helped by the work of a couple of our professors in terms of a historical role that both George Sanchez and Pierrette Handagno-Sotelo have played in supporting Latina and Latino studies here at USC, and more recently, Natalia Molina, who's on the advisory board for the center. So I want to introduce the three panelists, and then we have a series of questions. We're going to go back and forth. Hopefully it will be entertaining. We also are going to have an opportunity at the end of the session for all of you who have questions and would like to ask questions of our authors. So I'll begin at the very far end there. Pierrette Handagno-Sotelo is the Florence Everlane Professor of Sociology here at USC. She is the author of Gender Transitions, Domestica, God's Heart Has No Borders, Paradise Transplanted, and she has co-edited 5 other books or edited other books. And we are here, of course, to talk about her latest book, South Central Dreams. We have next to Pierrette, George J. Sanchez, who is the author of, and I will just say, this is going to be redundant because all of these scholars are award-winning scholars and whose books have won multiple awards. But George J. Sanchez is the author of the award-winning book, Becoming Mexican American, who, if you're interested in about Latino and Latina LA, you need to read that book, so I suggest you add that to your list. He's a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History here at USC, and he was the president of the Organization for American Historians during 2020 and 2021. And then closest to me is Natalia Molina. She is a distinguished professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at USC and is an official genius, according to the 2020 and according to myself, but also according to the MacArthur Fellowship. And she is the author of award-winning books, How Race is Made in America, Immigration, Citizenship, and the Historical Power of Racial Scripts, and Fit to be Citizens, Public Health and Race in LA, 1879 to 1939, and also recently co-edited Relational Formations of Race. All right, so I just want to begin before asking the questions that I've come up with a list of questions. I first want to just give a little bit of context. I'm excited and thrilled to be on this panel with these scholars because they've written recent books, 3 recent books, but also their previous work that is really fundamental to understanding one, Los Angeles and Los Angeles history, and second, more specifically, Latina and Latino LA. All the way, and the amazing thing about these 3 books is that they take different neighborhoods in LA, right? And they tell a very complex story, multi-layered story about the history and the past and the present of LA. But they do that from looking at it at 3 different neighborhoods. So from Natalia Molina's A Place at the Nayarit, to George Sanchez's Boyle Heights, to Pierrette Handagno-Sotelo's and Manuel Pastor's South Central Dreams, each of these terrific books ask us to reconsider the multiracial or polycultural past, present, and future of Los Angeles. So I want to thank you for joining us, and please help me welcome our wonderful authors for today. All right, so I think we've gone over, I've forewarned them about some of the questions that I'm about to ask them, but also I hope that through the conversation we generate questions from our discussion today. So each of these books in their own way reveal how people in LA have struggled to make community across racial lines and across the types of social divisions that have been erected by racist practices like segregation. And so I'm wondering that if each of you can speak to the kind of hopeful resilience that I think that all of you write about in your book, right? And especially if you could give us examples about how people have come together to build community and to build a sense of belonging in a city like LA, especially in the process of coming and confronting a lot of these challenging historical processes of racial segregation and economic exploitation. So why don't we start with Natalia, and then we'll just go down.
Sure. So I thank you all for coming. Thank you, Juan, for moderating for us and for asking such great questions. Los Angeles is the history of LA is often told from the top down. And so we don't always get a sense of immigrant LA. And it's also told in a way that we've erased a lot of East Los Angeles, not only actual East Los Angeles and places like Boyle Heights, but kind of anything east of Vermont. And so one of the ways that people find resilience in Los Angeles is really making their neighborhoods their own, really trying to design that urban landscape, live their lives in a way that reflects their own values, their own community, and not as urban planners designed it. And so the story that I'm trying to tell through A Place at the Nayarit is asking, how do immigrants make their place in a new homeland? And one way is through what I call urban anchors, restaurants. So you all have it, right? That bar you go to, the cafe you go to, the restaurant, your barber shop, where you get your nails done. It's that place where someone knows your name. It's that place where you feel you have dignity, where people smile, where you can go and speak your own language, or you don't have to feel like you're trying to take up less space. And so in a city like LA, where we tend to think of immigrants just as workers, this is a place where people can go and live three-dimensional lives. It's the way that bartender is now the guy with the great voice and singing along with the trio. The housekeeper puts on a pretty dress, and she's able to go with her family before the Sunday dinner, make the sign of the cross, and someone waits on her. And so, finding those places that we can claim belonging and that we can live our full identities is one way that people resist this.
George?
So one of the things that I think people don't understand about Los Angeles is some of the struggles that current immigrants have been a long part of the history of Los Angeles. And in Boyle Heights, one of the things I do is I take us back to the early 20th century when Boyle Heights was a majority of immigrants, but it was immigrants from all over the world. In fact, Latinos were not the majority in Boyle Heights until the 1960 census, just to put it in some context. I look at some of the struggles in the 20s and 30s was the forced repatriation campaign aimed at the Mexican immigrant community, and particularly in Boyle Heights, where Los Angeles lost 1/3 of its Mexican community when Mexicans were blamed for the Depression, starting with Herbert Hoover and local officials. And in response to that, many people that were growing up, Mexicanos who were growing up in Boyle Heights, they connected with other immigrants, and particularly with Jewish immigrants. They formed labor unions. They fought for their right to be here under Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And so they saw themselves, as opposed to the way the city leaders were looking at them, as quintessential Americans, people who had come here, had fought hard to be here, and now were fighting to not be repatriated, but actually to stay here. And it's in the Lady Garment Workers Union, it's in agricultural unions, it's all a bunch of unions in the 1930s that they kind of took their stand. And their children then grew up in institutions like Hollenbeck Middle School or Roosevelt High School. And they emerged in the 1940s to form new organizations that dealt with their citizenship and new arenas for battle, and particularly the Community Services Organization, which was a group that got Edward Roybal elected to the city council, the first Mexican-American to be elected in the city council in the 20th century. And by the way, the only one until 1985. Richard Alatorre's victory was be the next person who would win. So that's how long it took for Mexican Americans to be represented on the city council. All of that is to say that Mexicanos and Mexican Americans have been here for a very long time in Los Angeles, in a place like Boyle Heights, and they have fought with other groups, other immigrant groups, African Americans, to make sure that they were considered part of the city and that they had a future here in Los Angeles. And as time went on, they would continue to deal with the diversity of Los Angeles and the diversity of Boyle Heights to make sure that that resiliency stayed in place.
Hi, everybody. What an honor to be on this panel with these historians. And, you know, we're all telling parts of the same story, and it's stories of Latino life and history in the vastness of Los Angeles, spanning from Echo Park to Boyle Heights. And my colleagues and I, because this is a co-authored book, I'm just the only one representing here, but our focus is on South LA, South Central LA, which is the historically most important Black neighborhood in Los Angeles. And today is majority Latino. The majority Latino residents are here. So in our book, we look at this process. Did not happen overnight. It happens over several decades. 1970, South LA is 80% African American. Today it's about 2/3, but if you go to Watts, it's over 70%. Historic Central Avenue, 90%. First generation Mexican and Central American immigrants came here to South LA because this was a step up. This was a step up over crowded substandard apartments in Pico Union, downtown, on the east side. They came here hoping to buy their first house or to rent an apartment with a little more elbow room. When they arrived in the 80s and 90s, South LA was going through a lot of tumultuous changes. Deindustrialization, the crack cocaine crisis, gang turf warfare, over-policing, tough environment. A lot of Black families who were moving out to the exurbs, were leaving. New Latino families were moving in. And one of the tricky things we wrote about, all of us here teach courses about Latinos in the United States and in LA. We all know the story of discrimination and racism against Latinos. Part of the story we're telling in this book is our experiences or articulations of Latino anti-Black racism, especially among the first generation, that's informed by a whole set. It was kind of hard to write this, honestly. It's informed by a whole set of experiences from Mexico and El Salvador, where there is a different kind of white supremacy, a European supremacy. It was also informed for many people by an experience they might have had on the street. A little Latina lady having her gold chain ripped off at the bus stop. Maybe it happened one time, but that became seared in her memory. But over time, maybe I'm going on too long, over time, new relations were fostered with their Black next door neighbors. We look at something I call Black parental mentorship, African American adults and older folks helping new Latino newcomers raise their children. What are the good schools to go to? And in the second generation, we see a total turnaround, what we call a new kind of Latinidad that's really inflected with deep solidarity and closeness with Black people and Black culture.
Great, thank you so much. And we're going to return to a few of those themes, right, throughout this conversation. Before we do that, I want to get a sense of how many of you are from these neighborhoods? Can we see if you're from Echo Park? South LA? No? Boyle Heights? Yeah? How many West Siders do we have in this side? Oh, okay, all right. What about the SGV? Anybody? Yeah, okay, good. All right, so the reason I'm asking is because one of the fascinating things about all of these books is that they're trying to tell us, you can just see from each of the responses, right, really multi-layered, complicated historical processes. But what I love about each of these books is they do that, and one of the things that they had to do is to find the archive, find people who have been excluded from the archive, people that are erased and not seen as valuable enough to to commemorate or to put aside and learn from as we study. And so the archive has been absent, missing many of the voices. And so what I want maybe now is for each of you to talk about one or two individuals in your books. Because as you go to your neighborhoods in LA, I want you to pay attention, as Natalia says, who are the anchors? What are the anchor spaces, right? And try to engage with those, because compiling all of these individual stories helps us put together a bigger, more complex picture of the city of LA. So Natalia writes brilliantly, endearingly about Doña Natalia, who's also her grandmother and was the owner of Nayarit. So maybe, Natalia, if you could tell us more about Doña Natalia and how she fits into this greater story that is LA.
Thank you. So I think I'll back up and say, for my first two books, I went to the archives. And my first book was specifically on Los Angeles, and it was looking at the way that public health, ideas about disease, shaped our ideas about Mexicans, something we're very familiar with nowadays with COVID, right? Race and disease. And, I am known as a historian who will find a needle in a haystack. And so for this book, I started that process. It's a family history, but I wanted to embed it in larger LA. So I wanted it to be a way in which we could look at an immigrant story to tell a story about Los Angeles. And there was so little on Echo Park. It was this area that had been overlooked for over 100 years. And so now when people are talking about gentrification, and they're like, "Aren't you glad that there's that Starbucks there, that blue bottle?" I'm like, well, it brings a lot of change, and sometimes the residents have to leave. But it's also, we're seeing a lot of investment in Echo Park now, where there hadn't been before. And so in trying to tell my grandmother's story, it was difficult. I call this the history of trying to tell the story of the underdocumented. Sometimes they're undocumented, but they're just underdocumented, because it's not just that libraries and institutions don't keep people's papers and records, their archives. It's that even our own families don't, right? We don't know to value that history. And in my grandmother's case, she immigrated to Los Angeles at the age of 21 in 1921, sola, alone. And so there was no one even around to witness her history. And so it was like a needle in a haystack finding mission, where it was looking through the census, doing some oral interviews, looking through the Los Angeles time records, looking through La Opinión, trying to get a sense of Echo Park and at least people like her, so that when I would find something about her life, I could contextualize it. And I did some oral interviews, and I was able to find some of these things. And then one day it hit me, and I don't think I've told my cousin Carla this. Oh my gosh, I'm going to tear up. And she's in the audience. So one day it hit me. Carla, my cousin, who's like my sister, her grandmother would sit on her porch in Echo Park, first house that she lived in, only house that she lived in when she moved from LA. My grandmother helped to immigrate her. She rented the house to her until she could purchase it on her own. She worked at my grandmother's restaurant. And in the afternoons on Thursdays, or when El Echo newspaper would come out, they would mail it to her from Mexico. A lot of people from Nayarit get that hometown paper. And she would sit on her porch and read El Echo. And it hit me. The stories of my people will not be found in the LA Times, not only not in the archives, not in the LA Times, and not even La Opinión. And so Mexico City, their library, has the run of El Echo. And I did a 20-year investigation of all the copies of El Echo. And they have this column, it was like the Facebook for the time, called La Rueda Ferris, right? The Ferris wheel. And so I started learning about everyday lives of people from Nayarit, where they lived in Echo Park, where they lived all over LA. And then I found them in the census records. And then I did oral interviews. And through that, I was able to talk about and trace all these transplanted lives here. And then once a year, they would write to El Echo for their anniversary edition. And they would say, "Hi, this is Chayo Cueva. I'm here in Echo Park. I'm at 827 Rosemont. Come visit me if you're in LA. I'm so-and-so, and I live in Beverly Hills." And I was like, how does she live in Beverly Hills? I'd look it up. She was a housekeeper for Dominic Dunn, for Joan Didion's brother-in-law. Right? They were everywhere. And that's the thing. Our history is LA history. We just need to find those stories and tell them.
So let me tell you that often we face having to construct our own archives, whether we find them far away or whether we literally have to construct them from the get-go. And so I think the most significant part of my own research was being the lead investigator for an exhibit on Boyle Heights that the Japanese American National Museum did that opened in 2001, lasts for 9 months. But to do that, we had to identify people who had grown up in Boyle Heights, and then we had to interview them. And I'll tell you how that process unfolded, and probably the best person to focus on is a woman who reappears in my book several times, and that's Molly Wilson. She was an African-American woman who grew up in Boyle Heights. There's very few archives of this. There's a new group of Black Boyle Heights that's kind of making their way right now. But Molly came to us because we had an event from the Japanese American National Museum, and we're constructing this, that brought together people who were current residents of Boyle Heights with people who had been there many years before. And Molly was one of those that showed up. And they participated in wonderful discussions. But then at the end of this, Molly stood up and came, and she was a woman in her 70s, came to us with basic grocery bags full of letters. And she said, well, I think I need to give these to you. And we were like, well, what are they? Molly had grown up through the 30s and 40s in Boyle Heights. And her best friends in middle school and then high school were Japanese Americans, all of whom, when she entered high school, were taken away to be in internment camps from Roosevelt High School. And she made a decision, because this to her was an outrage, that her protest was going to be, she was going to write to her 5 best friends every day the war lasted. One on Monday, another on Tuesday, another on Wednesday, another on Thursday, another on Friday. She kept that up for basically 3.5 years while the war lasted. These were the return letters that her friends sent to her from various camps that they had been sent to. It showed an incredible passion that she had for these friends, but it also gave us a window into the racial interaction in Boyle Heights that was really, there was very little information about, but these oral interviews that we did as part of the building towards the exhibit were absolutely critical in helping to understand how important it was when people saw their neighbors, their classmates taken away to internment camps, when they saw discrimination against them. In fact, one of the questions we had for Molly later on was, boy, how, you were a teenager in high school. How did you write a letter every day and keep that up? Well, it became a history that she didn't tell us, but her friends told us, because we interviewed them together, that when she was in Hollenbeck Middle School, before high school, the principal there had taken her aside and said, Molly was very popular. You could still say in her 70s, you could tell the passion in Molly. But as a middle schooler, she was the most popular kid on campus. She was going to run for student body president of Hollenbeck. And the principal took her aside and said, Molly, we don't think it's a good idea for the middle school that you run for student body president. And Molly had been taught by her parents that those kinds of discriminatory behaviors are going to happen to you, and you have to keep your head up, and you have to just continue. So that's what she did. But all her friends who were Japanese Americans said, that's horrible. And they all decided nobody was going to run for any office at Hollenbeck Middle School that year. And so they all backed out. Molly never forgot that. She never forgot that. So when she hit high school and now all her friends were rounded up and taken away by the government, she said, I'm going to do this for them. And it was that kind of friendship that was incredibly important for us and for me to capture in the exhibit, but then becomes part of the story of Boyle Heights. So it's not a Latino story, but it's an incredible story about interracial connections that I think was important for me to tell in my book.
Yeah, those are great stories. I don't think I can, it's a high bar to reach here, but I'm a sociologist. So unlike, what I do as a qualitative sociologist is generally go out and interview people or hang out. That's a veritable methodology. We can just hang out. We call it participant observation or ethnography, but it counts. And I want to emphasize I was part of a team. Manuel Pastor, my colleague and co-author on this book, is a quantitative social scientist, collected lots of mapping, census data, but I was in charge of a qualitative team of amazing young people, many of whom who grew up in South LA had deep connections to the community. And altogether, we interviewed 197 people. Why we didn't interview 200 and just round up, I don't know. It was a mistake. But anyways, I'm being honest, it was 197. And I'm just going to tell you, I can't just zero in on one story, but I'm just going to talk about three people. One is I spent a lot of time, one is a man, I'm just going to call him Don Pablo. I met him at the Stanford Avalon Community Gardens in Watts, 209 plots, 9 acres. If you followed South Central Farm after it was bulldozed, you know half of those, then Mayor Villaraigosa allowed them to go to Watts and cultivate under the power lines. And Don Pablo is about 65 years old. He's had a really hard life. He's Guatemalan, he's Mayan, he is functionally illiterate, he's working at a hard manual job, but he's a community leader. He's a civic leader. He is an elected official at the garden. He's been a member of the LA Neighborhood Council in historic South Central. And at his church, he started a boxing gym for youth, right? Just like trying to help youth along. And he's done all of these things. You would think, wow, Spanish is his second language. He, can't really read and write. And I've seen him also get pushed back and be disrespected at City Hall, but he's not sitting down. He is mobilizing and, really trying to lift up South LA. The other two people, I'm just going to talk about three people, are two Salvadoran women, about the same age. Both of them live just a few blocks from where we sit right here in Adams and in Vermont Square neighborhoods. Both of them came to South LA with their families, looking for a better life, and raised their kids here. And one of the women, I'll just call her Doña Elvia for today, knew that both of these women, I want to call them Madres Luchonas. They're here. They're going to raise up their kids. They're going to do the best for them, totally committed. And every year she would go to the school and she would fight with the principal and the bilingual coordinator who wanted to put her kids in bilingual classes. She said, no, they're going to learn English at school, Spanish at home. So that meant her kids were the only non-black kids in the classroom. They had black teachers, black friends. She would take them to the library where black senior citizens read to them to help them with their English. Her kids did very well. One went to an Ivy League college and the other one went to UC, and the mother was like, UC, not really good enough for her. But she really, what I'm showing is that a route of Latino immigrant integration that depended on closeness with African Americans. The other Salvadoreña, I'll call her Doña Zulema. When I interviewed her, she had so many stories to tell me of problems she had with black people. She moved in next to a crack house. She thought the black teachers were unfair to her children at school. She told me she thought she had lost a baby because of poor attention from a black nurse at the hospital. But as an ethnographer, I'm not there to judge. I'm there just to keep asking, probing, asking questions. So we finally get around and she tells me, oh, I cried for 3 days when my daughter in high school told me she had a black boyfriend. 3 days. Well, now her daughter is married to this man, and this woman loves her black son-in-law, who lives with them, her granddaughter who sleeps with her every night, his family, who are like her sisters. So she retained some of this kind of anti-black, what we would call discursive prejudice, but the people she loves the most in her family are now African Americans who live with her in her home. So these are just some of the uneven ways of identity and real life formation in South LA.
Thank you so much. This is really hard for me because I could stay here all day. Every single thing that is said here just raises 10 more questions for me, and we're already halfway through this panel. So one of the things, I'm going to try to tie some ends together here. Pierrette was talking about immigrant integration, and I would just say, what is that, right? But more in the context of, I think one of the fascinating things about your book is that you say these old models of immigrant integration and assimilation don't work, right? And you talk about something else, right? A different process. And I think if you look at both Natalia's book and George's book, whether we say placemaking or whether we say multiracial democracy, each one of these is taking these neighborhoods and saying, we need to understand the complexity of Latinidad in these neighborhoods, especially as it relates to how Latinas and Latinos interact with other racial groups, and then what that tells us about the current, what's happening in this city now, and what will happen in the future in terms of reshaping American society, reshaping American democracy, redefining what Latina and Latino means, but also redefining what American means, right? And each of your books, I think, does this very well to say, it's not enough just to say this is a panel about Latino LA. This is a panel about LA, and these neighborhoods and these stories that each of you tell can help us understand what that means and what that will mean for future generations. So I'm wondering if you could just speak to that, right? Those kinds of connections and how that applies specifically to your work.
When I started writing the book, it was a way of getting at all the changes that I was seeing in Echo Park, and the displacement and the gentrification. And I'd been seeing it for about it started around 2000. I started the book around 2015, and I think we used to look at it through the lens of race. I think we're seeing very much, perhaps accelerated because of COVID, it's no longer simply a story of gentrification, right? It's like we're now in gentrification 2.0. What we're seeing is that even the businesses that moved in and gentrified, that, my aunt's store, Batea on Echo Park Avenue, that she had for 49 years, that her rent was doubled, so she had to basically cut the store in half so that a coffee store could move in next door. Even that place is moving out. There's another store that just bottle alcohol store, like a micro beer store. They just did a story in the East Sider Times about it. They need to move out. They can't afford it. We're also seeing the increased amounts of homelessness all over Los Angeles with COVID. So this is now, like, whether you're in an area that's being gentrified or not, if we live in LA, we need, in any city undergoing these changes, which nowadays is most cities, right? We need to ask ourselves, what are we willing to do as a community? What are we willing to, if we say, we want to move into a neighborhood because we like the culture, we like the way that the neighbors talk to each other, well, then let's make sure the neighbors can stay there. Are we willing to pass legislation, rent control? Are we willing to make sure there's affordable housing, a jobs program? What are we willing to do to actually live in community with one another? Because the idea of just, gentrification, well, these people moved out. People aren't able to buy in LA, California anymore, and let alone rent sometimes. So this is an urgent issue that we all have a stake in.
When I was writing my book, the question that kept coming up in my mind had to do with what's the legacy of all the multiracial organizing that I saw earlier in Boyle Heights history. And the legacy for me, Boyle Heights turned majority Latino in 1960, and then for the last 30, 40 years, it's been between 92 and 97% Latino. So, and it continues there. But what has changed dramatically in Boyle Heights is the citizenship and the legality, in quotes, of the residents. Boyle Heights became a place that undocumented people came to big time, and I estimate that somewhere between 40 and 60% of the population lives in some kind of mixed status household, where undocumented people live with children who are U.S. citizens. And what was interesting to me was to see the formation of new organizations, particularly in the 80s and 90s, that began to incorporate undocumented people into what I call non-electoral democracy. Active protection of the neighborhood, defense of the neighborhood, but incorporating ways to include people who could not vote in elections. And that was both Mothers of East LA and Homeboy Industries. In both cases, they took the parish politics and the Catholic parish politics, and they basically expanded that to include both legal residents, citizens, and undocumented. They had Mothers of East LA had no trouble organizing funds to send people to Sacramento. It didn't matter if you were legal or not, and because anybody can stick your finger into the face of a state legislature and said, you have to respond to this community. And they forcibly made sure that the state legislature had to translate everything. Everything took twice as long because English and Spanish both had to be said, and it had to be in the back and forth. That was incredibly important for Mothers of East LA in its politics, and is one of the reasons why it was quite successful in protecting Boyle Heights and making sure that everybody felt they were part of the community. Homeboy Industries, in their gang intervention program, one of the most successful, right away Father Boyle knew that part of the reason he was dealing with increased gang members in the late 80s and 90s was that they were the children of undocumented migrants from the 70s and 80s, and that he had to find a way that a job was going to be an alternative to gang membership. It didn't matter what their legal status was. That was a critical part of reducing gang involvement in Boyle Heights. And he had a lot of support from the Dolores Mission Parish and the residents there who were actively engaged in trying to protect the children that they saw as their own. It didn't matter what their legal status was. It doesn't matter, but they had to protect this neighborhood in the Flats area of Boyle Heights. So for me, I was taken by the new political organizations that adapted to the population in Boyle Heights. And to me, that's a critical window into how, at the local level, people were incorporated into a new politics, a new defense of neighborhoods that was absolutely critical. When you have 11, 12 million people in the United States that are undocumented, and we've been in this state since at least 1986, you have to figure out ways that those people feel incorporated into community politics and they can stand up and fight for their neighborhood just like everyone else.
Yeah, this is such a good question. In sociology, a lot of my colleagues are still using 100-year-old concepts like assimilation as cultural change is the way that leads to upward mobility. And everybody's, changing and learning English, but that aspiration for people in South LA is not necessarily to move out to a suburb. It's about making home here. So I'm very much in line with what my colleagues have said. Place making and really home making is what we have focused on in the South LA book. For many years, there was important transnational movement between across the border, right? People from Zacatecas and other states came here and formed hometown associations, raised money. For a while, if you were running for president in Mexico, you had to come campaign here in El Extranjero. But now, we have this border, this militarized border. If you're undocumented or if you don't have a lot of money, it's really hard to go back and forth the way it was once upon a time. 40 years ago. So that kind of back and forth transnationalism is no longer happening the way it was possible, I would say, before 86. And then a lot of, we do live in we do have 11 million people living in our country without full legal rights. It's staggering. It's staggering. And a huge deportation and detention regime. I wish we could say it was all just Trump who did it, but that would be a lie. I mean, it's been building since the 90s, this whole deportation industrial complex. But you know what? Not everybody is being deported and detained. People are making homes. People are making places. There are vibrant businesses. There are vibrant civic engagements that are happening in Boyle Heights. People are going to Sacramento. People who are undocumented and may not speak English are going to City Hall. And we have really emphasized in our book, homemaking is a place of belonging. South LA, people thought, oh, this is a stigmatized place. People are ashamed. No, to the contrary. People love and feel pride and want to lift it up and have worked over time to find a place where they feel secure, safe, have a sense of autonomy, walk around and feel as though they belong. It's an achievement. And it doesn't just fall from the sky. It's, constantly being made.
Great. So I want to just go back to a point that I think, Natalia, and give you a chance to, that struck me, that point that Pierrette just made about focusing on the homemaking aspects, right? And George's point about organizing and trying to build something collectively together as a community. Because I think so much of the conversation in the studies, we focus on the white supremacy and anti-immigrant policies, but spend less time, I think, figuring out how people are actually creating, a sense of home for themselves. And it leads me to this question, which is, all of you are telling these stories, different neighborhoods, but I'm wondering if you could, we've had this conversation in the past, just give us a sense of what Latino LA, Latina LA means today, right? Given this complexity, the way that your books are, telling these stories, but also in conversation to gay, thinking about the nature or the of Latinidad as an identity. So I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit to that point.
We're academics, so what we do is we take a question and we make it our own. So I'll tell you what I want from the book. What I want from the book is I want people to have a model to tell their own version of it, because there's so many versions of Latinidad now, right? I mean, my husband, Ian, who's in the audience, thank you, Ian, we watch Top Chef. This season, there's 2 Latinos, Mexican, Central American, right? Like these communities you didn't see when we moved here. I remember, I'm Filipino Mexicano, I'm Armenian Mexicano. There's just, it's an explosion of identities, an explosion of how one is Latino. And so what I would like is, I'm a former long-term substitute teacher. I do K through 12 teacher workshops every year. And so I've been developing a curriculum for the book, what it means to have an urban anchor, what it means to contextualize that within a neighborhood, and how then our students can go interview their local place, their local taqueria, their local dry cleaner, their local barber, so that they can tell their stories and then map it, like digitally map it, right? Because all the students they know technology better than we do. And so that collectively, let's say we're all in a class together, we all do that, and then we put it on a map, geotagged, and you love this because I could see Juan because he's a geographer. And then we start to see the city not as it was designed for the elite, but as we live it, and it's our LA.
Yes, we call that spatial appropriation. But anyways, go ahead, George.
So I very quickly, I think Latino LA now and in the future is going to be only more diverse. People from all kinds of national origins, people with all sorts of sexual orientations, people with all sorts of religions, people in different class standings. Every diversity that you can think about is going to be embodied in a version of Latino LA. And I think that's an incredibly important thing to keep in mind, that we're way past, Latinos who only speak Spanish, Latinos who only speak English, Latinos who are bilingual. I mean, every kind of diversity is going to be represented in the future. The big difference today is that Latinos are the majority of the region. And that is going to take some getting used to. That's going to eventually lead to a politics which is different, but it's also going to lead to a sense that this is our city. It doesn't matter who's in the mayor's office. It doesn't matter who, runs corporations. Yes, that does matter. But LA is Latino. And there's a kind of sensibility, which I'm thinking about, is starting to take hold in Los Angeles because of that issue. With all of its diversity, there's going to be a recognition that LA is Latino that is going to be part of our future. And I think about that in relation to cities like San Antonio or other places that have no problem thinking of their towns as Latino. That's going to be something that's going to be new for Los Angeles. And I'm kind of looking forward to watching that unfold as the demography sort of takes hold.
Well put by my colleagues here. What can I add to that? But to just echo it, a multiplicity of Latinidades. I hate this question. You always see it in op-eds or on the news, like, what is the Latino vote? Like, why is there one? As though everybody, or that those are really the wrong questions. But I do want to come back to just talk about South LA. And in South LA, the Latinidad is closely affiliated with African American identities and Black culture. So racial formations that happen among communities who may be marginalized from the white mainstream, or from Wendy Chang's racial ethnic sedimentation. Even if numbers of particular populations diminish, there's still this stronger tradition.
Yes, I think we in multiple ways are contributing to this because we all have multiracial children. Right? If I want to say we're about 10 minutes left, but if you have a question, if you want to make your way down, if we get the microphone down here, 2 points that I want to make before we turn over to the questions. The first point is that one of the issues that have been raised by our authors is that Latinidad is quickly moving away from ethnocentrism or ethno-nationalism because of the histories of LA, right? So to be Latino and to claim and talk about Latino political power doesn't mean talking about more brown faces only in power. It also means working in these multiracial organizations and multiracial partnerships, and that's what we see all the way in Boyle Heights from the multiracial work that George has talked about. And then the thing that we didn't talk a lot about, but what fascinated me with Natalia's work is the way that it was kind of a a cosmopolitan worldview and space that also was heavily affected by the LGBTQ queer communities in LA, and especially for Latino immigrants, that was a big thing, right? And of course, Pierrette is talking about South LA. So I think that those are just important, and so we might think about it again in our academic ways, rather than seeing it as ethnic power, that we're seeing it as multiracial democracy or abolitionism, where if one group is fighting for freedom for themselves, they're fighting for freedom for everyone, right? And so these are the kinds of things that we see play themselves out in the ground in LA, and why I think, not to say that there are no tensions, there clearly are, and all of our authors write about them, but the aspirations, as Pierrette said, is to move in this direction of recognizing that we live in these kinds of complex neighborhoods and communities. So why don't you introduce yourself, ask your question, and then we'll move on.
Dan Ramirez, curious for Natalia and George, your thoughts on how well Mexican Americans handled the influx of indigenous Mexicanos in the last 4 decades, who really scrambled our ideas of bilingual, when for them Spanish had always been the oppressor's language.
Not well. I think this is one of those diversities that has to be taken into account, given the real influx of substantial numbers of indigenous Mexicanos and other Latinos into Los Angeles. This is both a reflection of what has to advance in terms of racial discussion in Mexico and in other places, and then in Los Angeles. And that has some real repercussions into things like we're talking about in terms of transnationalism. I have a graduate student who's working on a dissertation that focuses on what's happened to Zapotec immigrants in Los Angeles that have come and then seen the border be militarized, so that the traditional things that they have to go back to their home towns, they can't do anymore. And it's incredible creativity on the part of indigenous migrants in trying to reshape those relationships. Everything from sending videos from Oaxaca here so that that can be part of the exchange, to actually in Mexico taking over some of the cultural exchange programs to bring elders basically to the United States. But now the elders all happen to be elders in families where most of the family is in the United States. So the elders that are coming to be the cultural exchange ambassadors are actually somebody's grandfather or grandmother, and they land, and there's family reunions happening on the basis of a cultural exchange program. So I'm finding the creativity that is happening within indigenous communities to be absolutely critical for us to know about and to recognize as a particular interesting way to think about how Los Angeles could do more to both acknowledge that as part of the history, but also to think about it as critical in understanding this relationship of indigeneity to our migrations.
Anyone else?
Or to say really quickly, just some of the backdrop for that is that there was for so long discrimination against indigenous Mexicanos, right? So one of the ways that we tried to marginalize Mexicanos, I say Mexicanos because I'm talking more about the early 20th century when they're the majority of the population, is to claim their indigenous roots. Mexicans are legal, Latinos are eligible for citizenship because they're legally classified as white. And for decades, there was an effort to legally classify them as indigenous, as Indians, so they wouldn't have citizenship rights. And so part of that lack of advocacy, lack of recognizing those rights is rooted in a deep anti-indigenous racism. One thing we saw during COVID is the way that not only immigrants were the ones that were doing all our labor for us, while many of us had the privilege of working from home, working remotely, working on Zoom, but we also saw this with the farm workers. And so the farm workers were the ones that were out there without the kinds of necessities, masks, gloves, all that. Remember in the time that we used to wash our groceries off, and they're the ones that were putting that food on our tables, getting our food to our grocery stores. And what you started seeing was that when they were finally getting the message out to the farm workers, it was the indigenous farm workers that didn't get the message. So they did not know what was going on because nothing was being translated for them. Nothing was being put on the radio in their languages. And so they were just going to the markets and saying, wait a minute, why is there no water? Why does the toilet paper now cost this much? And so there's real practical reasons, safety reasons, why people fight for materials to be translated, to be seen, to be recognized, but also to have rights, to have education, and to have access to health and safety.
Can I just add something? I wasn't asked to respond, but I do want to mention that in the last 20, 30 years now, huge indigenous migration from Mexico and Central America is providing the source of labor in the most exploited jobs. I mean, there's we need language translation, and people are having to learn Spanish, but to go to the fields, mestizo. Mexican farm workers who came from Michoacan and Zacatecas are now in better positions. The very worst positions are held by Zapoteco, Triqui, Mixtec. The very, very worst jobs held in LA's garment district are Mayan youth, children right here. It didn't just begin with the crisis on the border in 2014, and there is organizing. There are people in public health who are working on translating. There's Odilia Romero's group here in South LA, Cielo, that gave away $1 million to undocumented indigenous workers who were not going to get access to supportive funds. So we have a long ways to go, but I think that's just a huge issue that LA faces today as we talk about a multiplicity of Latinidades.
Great. We have a quick question, and we may have really quick responses, but go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christian Hernandez. I live like a mile away. Thank you, everyone, for showing the rainbow of what it means to be Latinidad. And that was a beautiful question, by the way, because language defines so much of our culture. My question for Pierrette, a very brief question. What were the expectations when yourself or when the team sort of took on this project? I mean, because I'm sure somebody knew the history of South LA and they went in expecting something, but the result was different than what you guys thought, or?
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Less than a minute.
Oh, less than a minute. Thank you for your question. Just, shut off my mic. This was, I really want to emphasize this. It was a team project. So it was a really beautiful experience for me to work not alone, but there were like 15 of us, quantitative, qualitative. We did this study because community leaders came to us, elected officials. They knew South LA had changed, and we had these old narratives that were still spinning out there in the ether. So we knew we were going to find something different than that. I don't think we were prepared to find as much love of place, deep, deep commitment. People who've gone away to college, say, and came back and want to raise their kids here, want to be part of it.
Thank you so much. We are out of time. I will remind you, we will be doing book signings upstairs. Please go out and buy this book, share it with friends, and let's give a big applause to all of our authors.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and visit us at podcast.usc.edu.